Okay, let's see. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Katie Chakowski, and I'm the Special Collections Librarian at the Portsmouth Public Library here in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And I'd like to begin tonight with our land acknowledgement.
This evening, I want to share with you just a few highlights from my book, The Life and Times of Jonathan Mitchel Sewall. After the book's publication, Jim Garvin, the former state architectural historian, wrote this to me. Except for the letter book of Governor John Wentworth, I have never had such a gateway to the world of thought of a person of Sewall's time and locale. And then he continued, Dorothy Vaughan used to say that we can't do history without genealogy. You have proven the point. So tonight, I'm hoping to provide a gateway for you into his time in this place, Portsmouth. In addition, I will tell you a bit about the research I did for the book. I used many of the resources we used for researching our own family tree or the history of our own home. One of the first things I did was make a family tree for him in Ancestry. My introduction to Jonathan Mitchel Sewall came with the purchase of this house on Gate Street. It did look a bit better than this when we bought it in 2003. This article from the Portsmouth Herald was included with the house documents. According to local tradition, he lived here from about 1788 until his death in 1808. When I read the article, it was certainly the first time I had ever heard of him. The article was written by Mrs. Marston Fenwick. She and Dorothy Vaughan, then the librarian at Portsmouth Public Library, collaborated on a series of articles on houses that should be saved from urban renewal, and our house was one of them. The article included this quotation, I would rather marry Mr. Sewall drunk than any other man sober. It was attributed to his second wife and had been included in a biographical sketch about him that was written in the Bench and Bar of New Hampshire, published in 1894. It did make him sound like a rather interesting character. But the problem with finding out much more about him was that, unfortunately, no one had written a book about Jonathan Mitchel Sewall. There were various obituaries that were easily found, and his own book of poems was published in 1801. Research is something I've been doing for a long time. Writing a book has never been on my list of things to do. But finally, after doing a lot of research, it was when I came across this quotation from Toni Morrison that I decided to have a go. If there is a book you really want to read and it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. And I didn't really begin in earnest until April 2020, when I hadn't gone to England as I'd intended, as no one was going anywhere then. Then when I saw this quote from Zora Neale Hurston, research is formalized curiosity, it is poking and prying with a purpose. It described exactly what I had been doing for nearly 18 years in my search for more information about Jonathan Mitchel Sewall.
Vain Britons boast no longer with proud indignity. By land your conquering legions, your matchless strength I see. Since we your sons incensed, our swords have girded on. Huzzah, 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 huzzah for war and Washington.
Shown here are the words to the song that you've been hearing. This rendition is available on YouTube and is performed by David and Ginger Hildebrand in costume for Fairfax County, Virginia's public schools. But to get back to the story, George Washington took charge of the colonist troops in Boston in June 1775. Soon after he arrived there, Jonathan, who lived in Portsmouth by then, wrote these words for a song that he called War in Washington. Shown here is a broadside that was printed in Salem and is preserved by the Massachusetts Historical Society. Salem is where Jonathan was born in 1748 and where he visited frequently all his life. This broadside actually includes the words, by Mr. Sewall of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. This copy with the woodcuts was printed in Danvers. The printer, Ezekiel Russell, had moved his office there from Salem in March 1777. It is also preserved by the Massachusetts Historical Society. The words were printed on broadsides like these, often after first being published in newspapers. They were large sheets of paper with words printed on one side only and were used much like a poster today. This one is about 7 inches wide and 16.5 inches long, so 2 copies would have been printed side by side and then cut. Broadsides were widely distributed, and I learned that the song was sung in all the colonial army camps when the soldiers were marching, and even in taverns and in homes. I found 2 newspapers that printed the words. The first was in the Massachusetts Spy on February 2, 1776. The Spy had moved their offices out of Boston in April the previous year. After that, they published in Worcester and added a new subtitle to their publication. Now their name was Massachusetts Spy, or American Oracle of Liberty. The words also appeared in the Virginia Gazette published in Williamsburg on February 24, 1776. The title given in both newspapers is A New Song, and under that, to the tune of the British Grenadiers. But there's no indication as to who the composer of the words was. A few years ago, my sister and I were watching Turn, a TV series about Washington's spies. A scene appeared with all the troops singing around a campfire. I couldn't believe it. I yelled, "They're singing Jonathan's song." I'm sure I was the only one who knew. I think that AMC deserved congratulations for their research. Usually, if colonial soldiers are portrayed singing during the Revolutionary War, you hear them singing Yankee Doodle. In 1777, Dr. Albigence Waldo was commissioned as surgeon of the 1st Connecticut Infantry Regiment. They joined the Maine Continental Army in the fall of 1777 at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. He kept a detailed diary of his life as an Army surgeon and of the conditions of the soldiers. In this excerpt, written during the horrible winter, his entry for December 14th is, "See the poor soldier, when in health with what cheerfulness he meets his foes and encounters every hardship. If barefoot he labors through the mud and cold, with a song in his mouth, extolling war and Washington." A story attributed to a British prisoner of war in Pennsylvania gives some idea of how the song was received by the British. This is from a journal entry written by a British soldier in eastern Pennsylvania on the 28th of January, 1779. He writes, "Not being able to procure private lodging, we have agreed to live entirely at a tavern. Our most disagreeable attendant is the noise of the American soldiers, who vociferate their song so loud that the whole house rings with War and Washington, a favorite ballad." There's a bit of a story about where I found this information, and it is incidents like this one that sometimes make me wonder if Jonathan has been hanging around the South End all these years. Maybe he was looking for someone to write his story and orchestrated this event, as well as some others that have happened to me while I was trying to find out more about him. One evening at the Christmas stroll at Strawberry Bank, way back in 2009, I was in the house where harpsichord music was being played. There were a number of people in the room when I entered, but they all left before Richard Spicer, the harpsichordist, had finished. So when his final piece ended, I thanked him and we exchanged a few words. When I said I lived in Gate Street, he told me he had written an article about music in colonial Portsmouth, and someone who lived in Gate Street, named Jonathan Mitchel Sewall, was an important person in it. Richard Spicer's article, Popular Song for Public Celebration in Federal Portsmouth, New Hampshire, was published in Popular Music and Society in 2001. He emailed me a copy, and this was one of the stories that he had found in his research. Now just a bit about Jonathan's early life. His father died in 1748, less than 7 months after he was born in Salem. In 1755, when he was 7 years old, he and his brother Stephen entered the Boston Public Latin School. They lived with their father's brother, their uncle Stephen Sewall. He was the Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Superior Court of Judicature from 1751 until his death in 1760. John Eliot, in his biographical dictionary of New England, writes of the Chief Justice, "No one's death ever excited a more general sympathy. He was as much beloved for his good qualities as admired for his superior wisdom." And he goes on, and then at the end he writes, "2 orphan children of his brother Mitchel Sewall, Esquire, were under his immediate care. It was his intention to give them every advantage of education. The loss to them was irreparable." 7 years after their Uncle Stephen's death, Jonathan's cousin, another Jonathan Sewall, became the Attorney General of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Their uncle had helped him go to Harvard, as his father had also died when he was quite young. Soon after Jonathan's cousin became the Attorney General, Jonathan came to study law with him and lived with the Sewall family in Brattle Street in Cambridge. During that time, his cousin was involved in the defense of enslaved people in 3 cases. In 2 of these, he managed to procure their freedom. These cases involving the defense of enslaved people were likely heard during the time he was studying with his cousin. Jonathan arrived in Portsmouth in the early 1770s to work and study with John Pickering, a local lawyer with a home and offices in Market Street. I discovered a number of interesting reasons why Jonathan may have decided to come to Portsmouth, but you'll have to read about most of those in the book. But one of them was, could it have even been John Adams' suggestion? Yes, the John Adams, who was a close friend of Jonathan's cousin. In the works of John Adams, we find this about the 2 of them. Adams wrote, "We attended the courts in Boston, Cambridge, Charleston, and Concord, lived together, frequently slept in the same chamber, and not seldom in the same bed." So here he is in Portsmouth, living with the Pickering family, nearly opposite the offices of the New Hampshire Gazette. At that time, their offices took up most of the corner on Market and Congress Streets. John Pickering's office was where the Kennedy Gallery is today, and his home extended back behind it down Commercial Alley. Market was the first street to be paved, and at that time it was known as Paved Street. We know that Jonathan became friends with Primus, the black pressman for the newspaper. Years later, when Primus died in 1791, Jonathan wrote an epitaph on the death of Primus that was printed in the New Hampshire Gazette and read at the graveside. One of the lines is, "But some in Paved Street well knew he was a hearty friend." Also, you will see that just opposite the printing office was the State House, where most of the business for the state was conducted at that time. In 1773, Governor John Wentworth appointed Jonathan as Register of Probate for Grafton County and a major in the militia. Shown here is part of a map that Samuel Langdon drew for Governor Benning Wentworth in 1756. You can see that there was virtually nothing shown where Grafton County was created 15 years later. One of the good things that Governor John Wentworth did was to attempt to connect the towns in the western part of the state with the coast. This made it easier for people and goods to travel across the state, and trade did not have to go down the Connecticut River to be sold, but could come across to the seacoast. The Province Road ran from the Durham area to Haverhill, and it was completed around 1773 and 4. It was described in a Granite Monthly article by George Upham that at that time it was the only highway to the west of the state that was passable for wheeled vehicles. It is not contended that this was a good road, but that it was so passable, doubtless requiring very careful driving in some places. Going to Haverhill for the court was going to change Jonathan's life. This is a small portion of a long poem that Jonathan wrote when his horse died. This isn't Jonathan or his horse, but a slightly altered painting by George Stubbs from 1768. The poem was written around 1776 or 7, and it is entitled A Dialogue with J.H. and the Author on the Death of His Horse. I'm not quite sure who J.H. was, and I wasn't sure what the poem was describing until I read about the conditions of travel on this New Province road at that time. I like to think he was giving details of his trips from Portsmouth to Haverhill or Plymouth or Concord. He even mentions the Merrimack River in one stanza. Poor hapless steed, the truest best, that ere by luckless weight was pressed. How oft in dirtiest, vilest road, o'er roots and stumps, through mire and mud, midst cold, thirst, perils, and fatigues, no barn within a dozen leagues. Though wearied, hungry, parched, and faint, hast thou, despising all complaint, and only studious to improve thy strength, speed, diligence, and love, bore thy sad lord with many a pack, a pleasing burthen on thy back. This notice announcing the wills and probate courts in Plymouth and Haverhill was printed in the New Hampshire Gazette in January 1774. It was when I discovered Genealogy Bank online that information for this book really started to take shape. Jonathan was frequently mentioned in newspapers by name. It wasn't necessary for me to search through old newspapers on microfilm or fiche, or even crumbly originals, in hopes of seeing his name. One of the cases in the probate court in Haverhill was for Daniel Garish Wood. Daniel's wife, Sarah, was one of the administrators. He had died in November 1773. The last probate that Jonathan signed in Haverhill was for Captain John Hazen on November 4th that year. And then 10 days later, he married Sarah Wood, presumably the widow of Daniel, as Haverhill was still a fairly small town. And then their son Stephen was born in Haverhill on January 1st, 1775. But this Sarah died a little over 2 years later. Jonathan gave up his job as Register of Probate and his position in the militia in 1775. On the 13th of June that year, Colonel John Fenton, the judge whom Jonathan worked with in Grafton County, visited Governor and Mrs. Wentworth at their home in Pleasant Street in Portsmouth. Fenton was a staunch loyalist, and a Portsmouth mob was enraged by his presence in town. Mrs. Wentworth wrote this to a friend from Fort William and Mary on June 24th. They stove at the house with clubs, brought a large cannon and placed it before the door, and swore to fire through the house. Fenton had surrendered, and the Wentworths left the house that night and never returned to Portsmouth, or soon after to New Hampshire for the rest of their lives. After they left, the house was used as a barracks for the militia for a short time. There was even a small room in the house that was used as a prison for some of the loyalists. You can see the bullet holes in the wallpaper in the living room to this day. The house was actually owned by John Fisher, whom I'm sure you have all read about in Tom Hardiman's book, Money, Revolution, and Books, about John Fisher and his library, which is now part of the Athenaeum's collection. Fisher was named in the Prescription Act of 1778, but not in the Confiscation Act. So he was banished from the state, but his property, including this house, was not taken. Then if we jump ahead 9 years, this advertisement appeared in the New Hampshire Gazette on 3 occasions in February and March 1787, noting that the house was now for sale and that Jonathan M. Sewall was living in it. If we look back again to November 1778, when they were writing the Prescription Act, we read in the Journal of the House, voted that the committee appointed in May last, together with Mr. John Smith and Jonathan Mitchel Sewall, Esquire, shall join to be a committee to draft and bring in a bill for confiscating the estates of sundry persons therein to be named, and lay the same before this House. Finding out about this committee made me wonder whether Jonathan got to choose a place to live from all the properties that had been prescribed but weren't up for sale at that time. At some point in 1778, Jonathan married Sarah March of Greenland. Her father, Dr. Clement March, was a very wealthy man, and he and John Pickering were great friends. So Jonathan had most likely known Sarah for some time. She was Clement and Eleanor March's 8th child and youngest daughter, and she was the same age as Jonathan. It was this Sarah who was warned about Jonathan's propensity for drink and was reported as saying, "I would rather marry Mr. Sewall drunk than any other man sober." In 1780, their son John was born, and in 1785, their daughter Caroline. So they, including his son Stephen, of course, must have all lived in the governor's mansion. From there, they moved around the corner to Gate Street. Their daughter Susan was born there in 1790. But back in November 1779, what became known as the Petition of Nero Brewster and others was addressed to the New Hampshire Council and House of Representatives. It was written by a group of enslaved men in Portsmouth asking for their freedom. But the petition was not read and considered until April 25, 1780. One thing that the petitioners themselves could not do was to make the presentation in court because a lawyer was needed to do that. Dr. Robert Dishman, in an article in Historical New Hampshire, said he believed that it would have been Jonathan Mitchel Sewall for a number of reasons. If we look at various Sewall family influences, we find that way back in 1700, his great-uncle Samuel Sewall wrote the first ever publication calling for the abolition of slavery. It was entitled The Selling of Joseph, and it was still referred to often those many years later. We know that his cousin Jonathan Sewall managed to procure the freedom of enslaved people in 2 cases, Margaret versus Muzzy in 1768, and James versus Lechmere in 1769. These suits against Muzzy and Lechmere in favor of an enslaved woman named Margaret and a man named James were won by Sewall, and of course by Margaret and James as well. This 1769 decision is said to be the first case in what is referred to as the Grand Question was settled, and it abolished slavery in Massachusetts. David Sewall of Wells, Maine, was another of Jonathan's cousins, and another good friend of the John Adams. David had studied law in Portsmouth with Judge William Parker and married his daughter. The article shown here is from the New Hampshire Gazette in May 1774. It tells the story of an enslaved man called Pompey who had run away. When he was caught, we read, having obtained the opinion of David Sewall, Esquire, respecting slaves, and he called it a pass, and he often showed it to people as such. David had procured the freedom for 2 men in an earlier case. Some of the other reasons had to do with Jonathan's reputation as a lawyer. He was well established by that time. He often gave his services for free. We know that he spoke eloquently, and he was obviously sympathetic to the plight of the enslaved people. Jonathan had denounced slavery in some of his poems. On the Gloomy Prospects of 1776 includes this couplet: "Then faith shall triumph, envy rave in vain, oppression tremble, slavery drop her chain." In another poem, a song written in 1776, he writes, "To burst vile slavery's iron band, guard sacred freedom, save your land." And later in his 1788 4th of July oration, O stretch thy reign, fair peace, from shore to shore, till conquest cease and slavery be no more. In July 1780, the New Hampshire Gazette printed the petition in full with the notice that it was for the amusement of our readers. Meanwhile, Jonathan's friend from Pave Street, Primus the pressman, was still printing many ads like those shown here. This is one of the great illustrations by Robert Squire in his and Dennis Robinson's Portsmouth Time Machine. Unfortunately, nothing came of the petition, but Jonathan was going to try again. We're going to pretend that this is John Pickering and Jonathan, because in one of his obituaries, someone wrote, "In his person, manner, gesture, and look, it is a striking fact he had a resemblance to Edmund Burke." This is Edmund Burke, who we see here on the right. New Hampshire's second constitutional convention was called in March 1781. Jonathan, along with John Pickering, George Atkinson, John Langdon, and Dr. Ami Rahami Cutter were the representatives from Portsmouth. John Pickering was chosen to draft the form of government, and Jonathan was to draft the Bill of Rights. Shown here are the first two articles. 1. All men are born equally free and independent. Therefore, all government of right originates from the people, is founded in consent, and instituted for the general good. Article 2. All men have certain natural, essential, and inherent rights, among which are the enjoying and defending life and liberty, acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, and in a word, of seeking and obtaining happiness. Jonathan may have thought that this would achieve the desired result, but it didn't accomplish the task of abolishing slavery in the state either. However, it is interesting to note that our New Hampshire Bill of Rights today has 39 articles, of which 22 remain exactly as written at that time. But now let's move on to some of the other interesting things that Jonathan was involved in. Various books that discuss the history of theater in Portsmouth state that there were no theatrical productions performed during the war until 1787, and then after the building of the Bow Street Theater in 1791. But it turns out that some of the gentlemen of Portsmouth, as they were described in the newspapers, were putting on quite serious plays much earlier, probably at Staver's Tavern or the Assembly Rooms. Addison's Cato and Shakespeare's Coriolanus appear to have been staged in Portsmouth in 1778. That was the year that General George Washington had defied a congressional ban on theatrical productions in May that year, and a production of the tragedy Cato was performed for the entire company based at Valley Forge on the 11th of May, after the dreadful winter there. But 2 months earlier, in March, the play had been performed in Portsmouth, and Jonathan had written a new epilogue to the play. In it, he equated Cato to Washington, Juba to Lafayette, and Caesar to King George. Doesn't it seem likely that the players at Valley Forge would have used Jonathan's epilogue? I found it printed in newspapers in Boston and Hartford, Connecticut, in April that year, so well before the performance at Valley Forge. This is just one section. Did Rome's brave Senate nobly strive to oppose the mighty torrent of domestic foes, and boldly arm the virtuous few, and dare the desperate perils of unequal war? Our Senate, too, the same bold deed has done, and for a Cato armed a Washington. A chief in all the ways of battle skilled, thy scourge, O Britain, and Columbia's boast, the dread and admiration of each host, whose martial arm and steady soul alone have made thy legions quake, thy empire groan, and thy proud monarch tremble on his throne. But there was one couplet from Jonathan's epilogue that became very famous. He had written, No pent-up Utica contracts your powers, but the whole boundless continent is yours. The play takes place in the city of Utica, where Cato and a small Roman Senate stand ready to defend the last vestige of the Roman Republic against Caesar. This article from April 1876 is asking for articles to take to the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. General Frank W. Miller was a centennial historian for New Hampshire. He was collecting things from colonial times that could be found in the state to take to the exhibition. Miller was going to send Daniel Fowle's old wooden and stone printing press that he owned. And we read, General Miller has also the old armchair in which Jonathan Mitchel Sewall, the Portsmouth poet of the Revolution, wrote the famous couplet, "No pent-up Utica contracts your powers, but the whole boundless continent is yours." I asked myself, where is that chair today? Jonathan's entire epilogue to Cato was printed in a wide variety of newspapers during the 1870s and 80s to celebrate 100 years since the time when it was written. The newspapers actually came from the whole boundless continent. I found the words in the Louisiana Democrat, the Wisconsin Republican, Jamestown, New York Journal, the True Flag of Boston, and the Sacramento Daily Union, among many others, as well as being reprinted in several New Hampshire newspapers, of course. And then the Bow Street Theater finally opened in a converted warehouse at the end of 1791. The building had a pit and a gallery, and someone wrote that it could seat 400, but that could be an exaggeration. Jonathan provided various poems for the plays that were staged there. Shown here is about half of the introductory prologue to his On Opening the Theater in This Town. But my favorite is the one for a prologue that he wrote for the evening's entertainment on July 31st, 1792. It was proclaimed by the director, Mr. Watts, and I think it does a wonderful job of describing the warehouse that was now a theater and the work of the managers there. I'm going to attempt this small section as Mr. Watts is no longer with us either. This begins after a bit about one of the managers. Methinks I see him with his magic wand, like some old necromancer circled stand. He strikes the warehouse and the fabric low, turns to a theater beneath the blow, where hogsheads, bales were once promiscuous seen. Here frowns a monarch, and there walks a queen. That wood, that mountain, and that beauteous valley was where the worthy owner once kept tally, where portermen with muddy hoofs once flocked, great Cronon Houghton Thologos has stalked. He was the main character in a tragedy. And where yon beauteous forms attract your love, dry goods, tier over tier, were piled above. Then, oh, this conjurer favor with your nod, if you refute that self-same potent rod, that from a warehouse reared this magic scene, shall turn all to a poultry store again. But now let's move on to some of the more amazing political events that Jonathan was involved in. He was a major part of so many things that happened in Portsmouth during his time here. You may have never heard of the Piscataqua River Bridge that crossed the Great Bay between Newington and Durham. I hope you can see it at the top of this 1857 map that I overlaid with a drawing done by John Fink Rowe showing the bridge and Goat Island. The bridge was completed in November 1794. You'll remember that the province road started in Durham. Previously, to go west to Concord and other interior parts of the state required crossing the river or some of its tributaries by boat. The bridge ran from Fox Point, Newington, to Rock Island with an arch onto Goat Island, and from there to Meter's Neck at Durham. The proprietors of the bridge also constructed a tavern and stables on Goat Island to accommodate travelers. So let's look at the evening of the 4th of July in 1800. The Federalists met at the Piscataqua Bridge Tavern after a day of celebrations in Portsmouth. We read in the newspaper, after dinner, a number of elegant and patriotic songs were sung. Among them was an admired original, composed for the occasion by Jonathan M. Sewall, Esquire. There were actually 16 federal toasts, but shown here are the first three: to the 4th of July, 1776, to President Adams, to Washington, the departed father of his country. There are 8 verses to the song, but this will give you a glimpse of what they were singing at the tavern on Goat Island that evening. Let wreaths of triumph twine your brows, loud paeans wake the joyful morn. This day a mighty empire rose, a nation in a day was born. Hail independence, shout the day, a Columbia rose to sovereign sway. And then sage Adams guides the helm of state. Our senators are wise and true, more skill in counsel and debate Greece, Rome, and Albion never knew. Still independence they'll maintain, though Europe bleed at every vein. But now let's look at what must have been the most exciting few days of Jonathan's life. He was such a great fan of George Washington. Many of his poems laud Washington. He translated Washington's entire farewell address into poetry so that we could more easily remember the words, he said. And he gave the solemn eulogy at St. John's Church here in Portsmouth on the death of Washington. In 1789, President Washington went on his New England tour from October 15th to November 13th. He traveled from New York City through Connecticut, Massachusetts, and into New Hampshire. He visited nearly 60 towns, and every place they greeted him. Then on the 31st of October, George Washington, the new President of the United States, rode into Portsmouth and was about to appear on the balcony of the State House. Here is another one of the wonderful illustrations from the Portsmouth time machine. But unfortunately, they missed out Jonathan. He was standing opposite the balcony you can see here, on a stage that had been erected in front of Mr. Pierce's shop for the chorus and the band. There's no indication as to which tune was used for this first ode. He was joined by his friends Sparhawk and Dame. First they sang with the town choir, "Behold he comes, Columbia's pride, and nature's boast her favorite son, of valor, wisdom, truth well tried. Hail, matchless Washington." Then Jonathan spoke out these words: "'Tis gratitude that prompts the humble lay. Accept, great chief, what gratitude can pay." Then he and his friends sang, "Let old and young, let rich and poor their voices raise to sing his praise, and bid him welcome o'er and o'er." Then the full chorus came in: "Welcome, matchless Washington, matchless as the deeds you've done." Again Jonathan spoke out, from north to south, from east to west, his fame unrivaled stands confessed. He and Sparhawk and Dame sang, This is he, by heaven designed, the pride and wonder of mankind. United then your voices raise, and all united sing his praise." And again they joined the chorus, and you can join in now too. "Welcome, matchless Washington, matchless as the deeds you've done." George Washington had been listening to odes and songs in all the cities and towns where he had stopped, but Portsmouth was as far north as he went, except for the boat ride to Kittery, of course. But they hadn't finished. Ode 2 was sung to Charles Wesley's tune, "For He Comes," and Ode 3 to the tune "For God Save the King," which of course everyone knew. Jonathan was most likely the reporter for the extensive coverage describing these several days that Washington spent in Portsmouth, that was published in the Gazette and the Spy. Elwyn L. Page wrote in his book George Washington in New Hampshire that he thought it was most likely Sewall, and so do I based on everything of his that I have read. At that time there weren't newspaper reporters. Someone just needed to write something and take it into the newspaper office. The Gazette published this on Thursday, November 5th, and the Spy the next day. George Washington wrote in his diary that while he was in Portsmouth, he walked through most parts of the town. People who live in Gate Street today like to think that on his way back to Brewster's Tavern, where he was staying, he walked down part of today's Gate Street, and so right past the Sewall's house. We know that Washington visited his secretary Tobias Lear's mother, who lived in Hunking Street, on Tuesday, the 3rd of November. From there, they may have continued walking up Hunking Street to what was then called Marcy Street today. They would have seen the South Meeting House across the street. Not this one, but the previous one. Dr. Samuel Haven was the minister there from 1752 until his death in 1806. According to Charles Brewster in his Rambles about Portsmouth, when the news of the Battle of Lexington had reached Portsmouth, Dr. Haven sat up a good part of the night with his family making bullets. If they headed up past the church, they would have seen Captain Daniel Fernald and his wife Beulah Nichols home. Daniel and Beulah were married the year before Washington's visit, and they moved into the house then. It was Beulah's family home where she had been born. Daniel had served in the Revolutionary War. At that time, the street running down from the house was known as Pierce's Lane, Manning Street today. So if the party turned right and walked down Pierce's Lane, the house they saw on the right, that facing the meeting house, was that of the Pierce family. It wasn't until 1795 that Captain Nathaniel Pierce sold the land opposite the church, and from then on, the house's address has been on Gate Street. Then perhaps Washington and his party turned left along what was frequently described as the highway. On the corner was this house, the property of John Marshall, a boat builder. He lived there with his wife Elizabeth and their young children. Nathaniel would have been 5, Elizabeth 2, and Samuel only 9 months old at the time of Washington's visit. Reuben Snell, another boat builder, and his wife, Lucy Marshall, lived in this house then. Their 4 children were Sarah, age 17, John 15, Lucy 9, and Nabby, who would have been 5. Charles Bellamy Grace, a cooper, owned this house opposite the Snell's home. A cooper made the barrels for everything that was being shipped. There was a shop adjoining the house. Grace had served as an artilleryman in New Hampshire's regiment during the Revolutionary War. But then they arrived at this house, and the Sewall family was standing out front. But this is not the modest little house described in the article that came with our house. How did this happen? Let's let President Washington and his entourage make their way back to Brewster's Tavern and look at why Jonathan and Sarah, with Stephen, now 14, John, age 9, and Caroline, who is 4, are living in this house in 1789, instead of the house that has been known as the Jonathan Mitchel Sewall House for over 150 years. As recently as 2020, when I thought the Sewalls lived in our house, I made this patch to include on the community quilt, depicting our house with Jonathan's signature, which you may remember from one of his 1774 probate records. The quilt can be seen at the Portsmouth Historical Society now. When we first owned the house, carriage trails, horse and buggy rides would stop in front on their tour of Portsmouth. The driver would talk about Jonathan Mitchel Sewall, the lawyer and poet who died in this house in 1808. In 1982, Portsmouth advocates did this important survey in which all the houses in the south end of the city were included. We almost got a plaque. You'll remember the 1958 article that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk with a picture of our house, home of one of Portsmouth's best-known citizens. Then there was this article in the Portsmouth Times in 1910. Jonathan M. Sewall, one of the most noted lawyers of his day and a poet-writer of eminence, resided in the house on the south side of Gate Street, the first house from Washington Street. C.S. Gurney systematically photographed all the key buildings and sites in the city and then collected them into his book Portsmouth Historic and Picturesque, which was published in 1902. There we see this picture and read, on the south side of Gate Street, the first house from Washington Street is the dwelling occupied until 1808 by lawyer Sewall, whose songs were so famous during the Revolutionary War. Sarah Haven Foster wrote and illustrated the first Portsmouth guidebook, and it was published in 1876. It was republished in 1884 and then in 1896. Her description reads, "In number 5 Gate Street lived Jonathan M. Sewall, our revolutionary poet, who died in 1808. Interestingly to me, number 5 was the old number when there were 4 houses between the house and Pleasant Street. In the early 20th century, the houses were renumbered. There are even less houses between our house and Pleasant Street now, but our house became number 64. In Charles Brewster's Rambles About Portsmouth, second series that he published in 1869, we read, prominent among the poets of the Revolution, whose verses carried spirit into the camp and stirred up the patriotic fires of those who performed the statesman's duties at home, was that philanthropic man, Jonathan Mitchel Sewall, Esquire, whose home was in Portsmouth and whose last place of abode was the house on Gate Street nearly opposite that of Captain Joseph Grace. Brewster wasn't quite accurate either, but he did say nearly opposite. Joseph Grace, of course, was the son of Charles Bellamy Grace, the cooper. Soon after we purchased the house in 2003, we went to the Rockingham County Registry of Deeds and had copies of the Sewall deeds printed for us. Their original deed for the purchase of the house in 1791 was from Joshua Wentworth to Sarah Sewall, wife of Jonathan Mitchel Sewall, and in it we read, "Certain lot of land with a dwelling house thereon, situate in Portsmouth. Said premises are situated on the southerly side of Gate Street, and now in the occupation of the said Jonathan Mitchel Sewall, Esquire." The deed gives no indication as to who lived on any side of this property, a detail that is found in most deeds. At various times when I was reading old deeds, I said to myself, well, that can't be true, because the people living next door aren't correct. But in every case where I had that thought, it seems it was true. An example is the 1854 deed for the house next door, 74 on this map, which states, "Easterly by land of the Mrs. Sewall." That would have been Jonathan and Sarah's 2 daughters, Caroline and Susan. I had become very suspicious when I reached 1794 in Jonathan's story. The Sewalls sold the back half of their property to John Seward, a mariner. The property line went straight back from Gate Street to Magdalen Street, as Howard Street was known then. When I looked out my back door, I thought that that would be all of Sharon's garden, a bit off the corner of her house, and part of the house on the corner of Howard Street. Then when looking at the 1793 deed for 11 Howard Street, I found that the land of Jonathan M. Sewall, Esquire, well, really Sarah, his wife, was east of it. War in Washington again. I even found all the words to his song in a newspaper from Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, from November 13, 1840. The Jeffersonian Republican included the words and this tribute. Among the revolutionary relics that have come down to our times is the following ode by J.M. Sewall, a patriotic strain which was sung throughout the country during the war and served to inspire zeal and courage in the cause of independence. No national lyric ever aroused more enthusiasm or was chanted with better effect than this war song. It was the favorite strain throughout the ranks of the Army in every part of the country and kindled the martial ardor and patriotic feelings of all.
Vain Britons boast no longer with proud indignity By land your conquering legions, your matchless strength I see. Since we your sons incensed, our swords have girded on. Huzzah, 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 huzzah for war and Washington.
My book might have ended with the discovery that I didn't live in the Jonathan Mitchel Sewall house, but Tom Hardiman had been good enough to read through the book as I was writing it. When I sent him the final chapter, he commented, "I think this is an excellent conclusion to the book, but perhaps too serious and sober for a book that begins so sprightly with your own parody on a preface. Perhaps you could embellish it with a bit of verse of your own." You'll have to read my parody on a preface in the book. But anyway, I wrote this with the help of an online rhyming dictionary. Don't worry, I'm not going to try to sing it. Vain Hammonds boast no longer, for tradition can misguide. Your house was not the one where Sewalls lived and died. For the deeds declare they were not there at all. Huzzah, 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 for maybe he came to call. However, I'd like to finish with this very appropriate quotation from the English writer Samuel Johnson from the 1700s. Many things which are false are transferred from book to book and gain credit in the world.
Thank you so much to Nancy for her wonderful talk. Thanks, Nancy, for recording it. And everyone, Nancy is here with us. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourselves or put your questions in the chat.
Actually, I have a quick question for Nancy, just a personal one. So were you happy or were you really sad that he was not in your house? Did that make you love your house more or not?
Well, one thing we can't actually figure out who did live here, but my sister and I decided that we were really happy because we knew that they actually went to George Washington's ball, and we couldn't figure out how Sarah would have ever got dressed and then made her way down the stairs here because they're so steep. So we thought it was much better she was living in a bigger house.
Thank you.
Nancy, can you tell us where people can get your book besides the library?
It's for sale at the Athenaeum, at the Portsmouth Historical Society. They have it at Chief Street Books. And obviously it's available on bookshop.org and on Amazon. And any bookshop that would order it. Oh, and Water Street Book has some in Exeter as well.
That's great. Great. Well, if there are no questions, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And especially thanks to Nancy for her presentation and all of the research and the wonderful new book we've been able to add to our shelves. So thank you, Nancy. That was a great talk.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us. I have put the links to the feedback form and our newsletter in the chat. Again, if you fill out that feedback form, you'll be entered automatically to win a prize. And the prize is a library tote bag made here in New Hampshire. Very high quality.